To me, that day represented one of the finest hours in American history.
In the early 1960s, answering the president's call to action, young people had a new way in which to serve: the Peace Corps. The Corps' first director was the president's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver.
Messages kept pouring into the White House from people, younger people for the most part, but older people too, saying, yes, I'm ready to serve.
I thought joining the Peace Corps was a perfect way to do good in the world. I mean, I thought it was sort of hands across the ocean. Then I was going to go and help the poor people of the world do something better with their lives.
Marnie Mueller was sent to Guayaquil, Ecuador.
It was somehow giving people the notion that if they got together, they had power to make change.
The Peace Corps was also a way to counter the appeal of communism in the developing world. Other young Americans responded to the president's Cold War call more directly.
We're being trained to be in the military, to do what the military does, to fight if we have to defend the country. So, I mean, we all wanted to go. We thought, I mean, this was our job.
On the same day that President Kennedy established the Peace Corps, he provided more funds for an elite group of warriors called the Special Forces. They would become known as the Green Berets.
This is another type of warfare, new in its intensity, ancient in its origin, war by guerrillas, subversives, insurgents, assassins.
The very first mission for these highly trained soldiers would be in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia. When President Kennedy took office, there were 1,000 military advisors in South Vietnam, sent there to defend against what America believed was communist expansion. It was a policy based on something called the domino theory.
In a sense, we saw if Vietnam falls, the dominoes will fall. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the rest of Southeast Asia would fall under communist domination, and they would be strengthened across the globe. And it was to prevent that Kennedy felt he had to make a move to strengthen the South Vietnamese government.
The South Vietnamese government, run by Ngo Dinh Diem at the time, needed the help. The leader of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, wanted the North and South to be reunited. He was supplying guerrillas in South Vietnam who were growing in numbers and aggressiveness.
In Vietnam, you had an insurgency, Viet Cong. They are the insurgents. We become specialists in counterinsurgents.
Bill Bowles was one of the first special forces sent to train South Vietnamese troops in the fall of 1961. President Kennedy had increased the number of military advisors to more than 3,000.
We had trained this civilian irregular defense group for maybe a month, and we decided to send them to villages around Da Nang, and we had 4 Americans out there. And on the way between the villages, they were ambushed by the Viet Cong. 2 of my buddies were killed, and 2 others were missing. I was shocked. I guess more than anything, it brought home the idea, hey, this is not play. This is not a game. This is not a training exercise anymore. This is kill or be killed.
By 1963, the situation was deteriorating. On the streets of the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, President Diem, desperate to maintain control, was cracking down on his political and religious opponents. In protest, Buddhist monks set themselves on fire. For many Americans, these were the first television images they saw of Vietnam.
It was a horrible, horrible experience because in a sense, we saw Vietnam disintegrating before our eyes, or at least the structure of the state disintegrating. Diem had lost control of it.
American policymakers supported a coup to remove Diem, which resulted in his assassination. U.S. complicity in Diem's death and the resulting turmoil in South Vietnam only deepened America's involvement.
As I left there in '63, it was obvious that the war was escalating. We had camps in places you couldn't even say the name. And we had more people getting killed than ever before.
America would commit more and more soldiers. It would become the longest war in American history. It was fought largely by young men, described by one journalist as rock and rollers with one foot in the grave. But in the autumn of 1963, very few Americans were paying attention to Vietnam. There was so much to feel good about at home. The country had never been more prosperous. People were looking towards a bright future. At this point, they trusted their leaders to solve the problems elsewhere.
World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance.
In June of 1963, in a speech the president gave at American University in Washington, it seemed that maybe even the anxieties of the Cold War could be dispelled.
But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements.
Khrushchev and Kennedy had both convinced the world that they were real tough guys, and they wouldn't back down. That's exactly the time that people then sit and negotiate out their problems. Both men understood that, and Kennedy laid that out.
Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man.
2 months after that speech, the U.S. and Soviet Union agreed to the first comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty.
Dean Acheson said once that the office kind of confers a nobility on the man. And during Kennedy's tenure in office, we had a very exalted sense of a president. Our young emperor, you know.
In the summer of 1963, John F. Kennedy's political and personal ratings were the highest of his presidency.
Because he was the first young president, he was a towering cultural figure. I mean, the pictures of him walking around with his little kids and whatnot had enormous impact. It made us feel 10 feet high. We thought that we were invulnerable.
President of the United States, and what a crowd, what a tremendous welcome he's getting now. And there's Jackie. She's getting just as big a welcome, and the crowd is absolutely going wild. This is a friendly crowd in downtown Dallas as the President and the First Lady pass by.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by just a moment, please.
It did seem as though everything came unpinned. I was sitting in a dental chair when the first bulletin came over, but then the bulletins became increasingly serious, so that within an hour, about the time I was out of the chair, Jack Kennedy was dead.
Dallas, November 22nd. President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed here today, period. The president suffered a massive gunshot wound in the brain and was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
So I dictated my story that day. And this was such an unexpected, unbelievable thing that had happened. It was terribly emotional. No Americans living at that time had ever witnessed anything like this, the assassination of a president. I mean, that assassin's bullet killed something else. The feeling of, if you're exalted, you're invulnerable. All of a sudden, you know, even this guy is vulnerable, for God's sake.
pride, like many Americans. We had our differences, but I felt we had lost a friend. We had lost a leader. He was such a source of inspiration. How did we make it? How did we survive? Where did we go from here?
With the death of Kennedy, the end of the feeling of progress was never going to end. The innocence, the reality, slap in the face, national car crash.
I think some of the self-confidence of America died that day. Some of the optimism of America died that day. Walking up Connecticut Avenue to the church, and you'd look at the people who were watching us walk up the street, and there was absolute incredulity on the face of every living person. You get their eyes and your eyes, and what they were looking at you for was hopefully to get some expression from your face, from your eyes, that would help them to understand what had happened and why. And nobody understood it.
For an already shaken America, there were yet more crises ahead. We'll see that on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us.